Okay, so let's start with the oysters. Here we go. And let's bring this up full screen. So, okay, I assume everybody can see the presentation here. As we've done in the past, because we're dealing with the pandemic, I'm not going to focus too much on the analysis of the pandemic. I'll be happy to take questions afterwards. So just to put this in context, I think the oyster industry has suffered and been affected by the pandemic more than any of the other seafood products we're talking about. And the reasons is the absolute shutdown in volume. And what you can see here has happened. This is imports of both New Brunswick and PEI oysters by month into the US. And you can see in April, May, and everything, there was practically nothing. It really shut down. And so these price levels, which reflect the volume, are not significant because there was almost no volume going in. But now if we look at where we are, like in September, this is, let's take PEI first. This is PEI shipments to US in September. If we look back here to September of 2019, we see this big drop in volume. And that's because of the lack of restaurant buyers. If we look at New Brunswick as separately, New Brunswick's fared a little bit better because this is August, September exports from New Brunswick. And if we look back to August, September, we're sort of below August, but we're a little bit above where we were in September. So we're sort of in the ballpark. The volume from New Brunswick shippers has not dropped off as much as the volume has from PEI shippers. Now we are talking about the live oyster market. I think I'm going to rearrange like I said, I'm going to rearrange the order here so we can talk about oysters first and then come back to the pandemic. So let me just get out of this full screen view, and I'm going to skip over the pandemic thing. And now we're going to start specifically on the oyster slides. So overall, if we look at the total market, half shell market from PEI in New Brunswick, we've not seen a recovery in volume, but we have seen a maintenance of export price levels. In other words, it's not really possible. The Canadian shippers have been able to maintain their export values to some extent by drastic cuts in volume. On the US side, and we look at farmed oysters on the East Coast, it's really been a disaster. US producers have seen a huge erosion in their market and as much as 50% price drop for the oysters that they can sell. So what's happened, in my opinion, is that if we look year to date, the farmed oyster volume, this is Canadian exports to the US, is down 45% overall. You can see these blue you can see these blue bars here is 2020. But the pricing has been much more consistent. And so what's happened is that the volume of oysters that has been offered for sale has matched kind of where the demand is and where the restaurants have continued to buy oysters. But that's not a solution for growers and for companies that have oyster leases with unsold oysters that are getting bigger. So year to date, This shows Canadian pounds for 3 years, up through I think September's our latest, possibly October. But you can see that we're way down because partly we missed those shipment months of April and May, but also since then we've generally been at lower volumes. But you look at Mexico, and you might ask yourself, well, what oysters does Mexico produce? Mexico actually produces a large amount of the Pacific Gigas oyster, and they ship it to buyers on the West Coast. And it's a much lower priced oyster than the Canadian farmed oyster. But you can see that in Mexico, the actual volumes of a Pacific oyster have actually increased year over year. And I don't have a explanation for that. I think that they go into somewhat slightly different markets, but we know the oyster on the half shell, the farmed oyster, has been suffering a great deal. Even though it's not a large volume, exports to Asia have recovered, and that's been a positive sign. If we look at, for example, exports to Hong Kong and China, Singapore, other Asia, they're back up to the levels where they were, or close to the levels where they have been prior to the pandemic. And even though that's not the same type of volume as gets shipped to the U.S., it's important that those export markets are healthier. And you can see the export market pricing is held up quite well compared to where it was a year ago. So now the real problem is that the oyster growers in the U.S. are just having a very difficult time. So the sales from the oyster farms, Massachusetts and Virginia, are down about 50% from 2019, and Massachusetts maybe 43% from the 5-year average. And of course, they're getting the oysters that are on the bottom are growing, are getting large. So some oysters are even being dumped because they can't be sold. Now, part of that has been an innovative program that's coming to the U.S. to support the oyster growers in terms of putting oysters on reefs that they're natural reefs they're trying to build up. So there was several million dollars in funding from Pew and the U.S. government to buy at least 5 million oysters, and then they're populating 27 acres of reefs, both on the East Coast and on the West Coast. There are more than 100 companies are participating in the program, and supposedly it's supporting about 200 jobs among those companies. Now, what's happening is they're buying the oysters at a discount to the old market price, but they're buying them above the current market price. I think they're paying for these reef programs, they're paying about 45 cents a piece for farmed oysters. Normal pricing from the East Coast farms for the last couple of years has been 55 to 60 cents a piece. This is the individual oyster. And these are US dollar pricing. The current market value for oysters trying to be sold on the open market is around 30 cents. And you can see, so it's just a matter of hanging on. It's not really a viable business at the moment. And the question is, how's it going to come back? In a lot of ways, this recovery is going to take more than a year. It's not going to snap back later in 2021. First of all, the larger oysters, which are still taking up room in some of the cages and in some of the bottom areas, will lose a lot of their market value. So they're going to have to be sold as a discount. In the Gulf and even in Chesapeake, there's more of an infrastructure for shucked oysters, but there's not an infrastructure for that in New England. But it's likely that some of these larger oysters will get pricing comparable to that goes into shucking oysters for other uses. So this is the fact that we've not sold this current crop is going to slow the growth of the more profitable oysters when business returns. And the more profitable ones are the smaller ones, obviously. So if we look at what's happened with US farmed oysters, after this rapid growth, supply is kind of stabilized. And so the growth didn't continue forever. And if we look at Massachusetts, this is Virginia on the right, Massachusetts on the left. We also had some rapid growth, but the number of acres in cultivation has begun to decline somewhat. Not all of the farms that went into business in 2017 are still in business today. So the acres and the production, acreage is declining and production has been more stable. And this year, of course, people are just trying to hang on till something changes. So the reason is that the oyster industry is much more tied to restaurants than crab and lobster, for example, or even cold water shrimp. The boom in oyster popularity was really a boom in oyster bars and in the use of raw oysters in restaurants by a whole new generation of customers. And that has been very positive, and their desire to eat oysters is very much there. It hasn't been eroded. But when the restaurants are closed, it's impossible for people to get these oysters. There's a lot fewer people who know how to shuck or use their own oysters. And the other problem that's been difficult in the US for the oysters is that because of the health requirements and the certification requirements for bivalve shellfish, there's been less ability of oyster producers, local farmers, to sell their oysters directly to consumers, as some other fresh fish operators have been able to do. The inspection requirements for oysters have prohibited that. So we just haven't had as many outlets to compensate for where these live oysters can go. Now, what I mentioned before is that the New Brunswick production has held up better than PEI. You can see here New Brunswick is yellow and PEI is purple. And although PEI is larger, they have come back to a lesser extent than the New Brunswick producers. And the only thing I can attribute this to is that the New Brunswick producers have some established markets. They're more disciplined. They tend to sell to these same types of customers. And so to the extent possible, they maintain these relationships. Whereas the PEI oysters are more dependent on some of the independent restaurants. And of course, there's also been retail sales. There are some oysters sold at retail. I don't want to discount that, but the retail sales have been stable. We haven't seen the kind of dramatic increase, at least I've been able to find, that we've seen in some other items. So what's going to bring the industry back? I think it's going to need a revitalized growth in restaurants. You know, we still have a relatively small number of restaurants that are serving oysters, even though it increased substantially in the last few years. So I think that one of the strategies going forward is to reinvigorate oyster bars and restaurants, possibly through some type of marketing campaign. So in my view, the larger companies, and this is true both in Canada and the US, are better able to manage through this crisis than the smaller companies and the individual farmers. So if you take companies like Raspberry Point, Beausoleil, or Island Creek in the U.S., these companies are positioned to get through this crisis better than some of the smaller companies. I think also the farm production is more stable than the wild harvest because the wild harvest goes forward in PEI. We're not sure what kind of reception it's going to get. Remember, a lot of the wild harvest goes to the lower end of the restaurant trade, the kind of bars that do the buck a shuck promotions and things like that. And those guys are all closed down right now. So I think that's affecting the value of the wild harvest. I've said that the retail sales are continuing, but I think that the revitalization of restaurant sales is really going to be critical. So that's a quick summary. I think that in the interest of time, I'm happy now to go back to a discussion or questions, whether it's on oysters or the pandemic. So thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you, John. Again, great presentation. Lots of info for us to digest. Pour tout le monde, si vous avez des questions, if you have any questions,
for everyone, if you have any questions,
dans le chat Zoom, juste à la
write
droite.
them in the Zoom chat, which is at the right of your page, and we'll be able to read these questions to John.
And John, I also noticed there was a few questions that came in for shrimp while you were presenting oysters, so we'll email them to you afterwards. Unfortunately, I think that the person who did ask the question is no longer online. So,
okay, that's fine. I mean, I feel like it's interesting. Excuse me. Interesting here that that with shrimp, it's like a classic. You know, the market supply is caught up to demand. With oysters, we see that the market has really shrunk because of the lack of restaurant sales, and we're going to have to find creative ways to deal with that.
I see that even though Brian, who's the one who asked the question, is no longer online, I might ask it anyway for shrimp, and then we can go back to oysters. He was asking if the Penless Jordani, West Coast shrimp, are competing with our cold water shrimp from Atlantic Canada.
Yes, definitely. They are very competitive in Denmark because often they're priced at a lower level, and the Danish market can be very price sensitive. They're also competing on the West Coast, where the main advantage of the Canadian product is the larger sizes. You know, the Pandalis Jordani tends to run smaller than the Borealis. And so when you see Canadian exports in the US to the West Coast, the larger shrimp is more of a unique product, and the smaller sizes, 250, 350, is more directly competing with the Jordani.
Perfect, thank you. Now, if we go back to oysters, I'm looking through the chat. I don't see any questions. Maybe some of them are typing it right now. But maybe I'll ask the questions in the meantime. We do still have a few minutes before the next presentation. Given the pandemic and a lot of the health concerns out there, have we seen any increases in kind of health-focused foods? Because some could make the argument that oysters are some of the healthiest seafood that you could consume. I'm just wondering if there is some sort of correlation and if we could use that to our advantage.
Well, it's definitely a marketing advantage, but the problem is the shucking. People are expecting to get their oysters already opened for them at the restaurants. It could be that promotion of frozen, you know, in the mussels, there's a half shell mussel that's sold, and there's a little bit more On the mussel side, I think there's a little bit more product differentiation for cooked mussels and for half shell mussels. I think that maybe some experiments with retail sales of frozen half shell oysters already open in some fashion might be one way of kind of persuading people to try them at home.
Perfect. We have a few more questions that came in. So the first one here says, this is not a question to John specifically, but wasn't there a contamination outbreak in the PI oyster this summer? Might explain the decrease in their sales. That's possible. Any comments on that, John? Or
well, I think you got to look at the U.S. sales and the Canadian sales through the same lens, and the fact that the U.S. I would expect the Canadian exports to be at 100% strength when the U.S. farmed oyster, which is also very preferred by the restaurants, is at 50% or lower. So it could. I think that whatever reduction might have been in PEI was filled in by other parts of the market. I don't think, and so, but I'm not that familiar with how much the contamination might have reduced supplies.
Very difficult to determine. There's another one here. It says, when you compare the price paid by the US program for artificial reefs, what is the actual price the farmers have for their product?
Yeah, the purpose of this program was to help the farmers. So just in a very rough comparison, in a healthy market, farmers are getting around 60 cents per piece for a standard premium half shell with the right cup and everything. This is a high quality premium oyster. The reef building payments were about 45 cents per piece. And okay. the current market, if a farmer harvested their crop and went out to sell it to, let's say, an open market non-existing customer, they would be offered around 30 cents.
I see. Interesting. There's also a follow-up to the conversation we had earlier regarding marketing around health benefits. So it was asking if any promotional or educational campaign could help kind of bridge that gap. But I also, from your response earlier, I think it also has to do mostly with product format. Maybe we need to investigate new product format for their shift to retail.
Well, I think there's a marketing opportunity potentially with some restaurant partners, because once things begin to improve in terms of restaurants being able to be open, I think there'll be some effort to get people back into restaurants. And part of that might be, promoting oysters as a product that you weren't able to eat at home, and now you can come eat all the oysters you want at the oyster bars. Mm-hmm. So kind of, I do think there is some opportunity to promote oysters as something that was taken away during the pandemic, mm-hmm. and now has come back.
Great, thank you. It's almost 2:30 now. I don't see any more questions, but
okay. I'm gonna, Maxime, I'm just take about 3-minute break. I'm gonna put off.
Yes, absolutely. Take a break, and we can start.
Maybe in 3 or 4 minutes.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah. Okay.
Perfect. All right. Donc, pour tout le monde, si vous avez d'autres questions, vu qu'on manque un peu de temps, n'hésitez pas à les envoyer à ma collègue Nicole Hanlon. Je vous écris son courriel maintenant dans le chat. Elle va pouvoir rediriger vos questions à John. So for anyone who has any further questions, you can send it to my colleague Nicole. I just wrote her email down in the chat.